The awful shadow of some unseen power floats, though unseen, among us. That unseen power is the power of universal history. We want to welcome you to today's Manhattan Town meeting, a meeting that is happening amid tumultuous events and certain events which have been very dramatic, particularly in the last 24 hours. We want to start by referring to one such event, and that happened Friday night in Buenos Aires. The Vice President of Argentina, Cristina Kirchner, was entering a car. The assassin walked up, took aim, and pulled the trigger. Nothing. He pulled the trigger again. Again, nothing. Cristina Kirchner was unhurt. The gun did not go off. I have stared into the face of death, and death has turned his face away from mine. Had a miracle occurred? The shocked nation for a moment stood still. Did people sleep that night, or did the nation dream of what it had become and what it might be once again? Did it remember its earlier important mission? The next day, people gathered all over Argentina by the tens of thousands, and 1 million gathered in Buenos Aires. The talk was of unity against the madness of political violence. Something more than the life of the vice president, so surely about to be lost only hours earlier, had not only been saved, but a nation's optimism had suddenly, in a twinkling of an eye, been reborn. The fact that the assassin in Argentina, or would-be assassin, wore a tattoo at his elbow of the Azov Battalion of Ukraine, which is a variation on the Nazi SS logo, demonstrates the global significance of the battle that we've been involved in to shut down the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation and other blacklisting operations. We are not dealing with a Ukrainian phenomenon. We are dealing with a universal phenomenon. And over this next 10 days, beginning with our a press conference that will happen on September 7th, convened by the Executive Intelligence Review, what we will be doing is featuring the work from the Executive Intelligence Review, Ukraine's Information Terrorist Blacklist, Global NATO Issues Hit Order Against Advocates of Peace. That'll be featured, as I said, on at September 7th at a press conference, and you can get more information by contacting us about this. The next day, on Thursday, September 8th, will be an all-day celebration of the centennial of the birth of Lyndon LaRouche, founder of Executive Intelligence Review magazine and a co-founder of the Schiller Institute Human Rights Organization. And then what will happen is on Saturday and Sunday, September 10th and 11th, a two-day conference called Inspiring Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. That will be keynoted by Helga Sepp LaRouche, founder of the Schiller Institute and wife of Lyndon LaRouche. What we want to do is to prepare the groundworks for the work we're asking you to be involved with us in over the course of this next 10-day period. And it's work that will be momentous and it will be difficult, but it can be successful. Now, to talk about that and to describe more of what we are looking at, not just internationally, but in terms of the prospects of this mission, we have Harley Schlanger, spokesman for TLO, and with us here, as he often is, to get us started. And then later we're going to hear from Lyndon LaRouche himself in a bit of a dialogue together with Harley. So, Harley, good to see you, and take it away.
Okay. Well, I want to start with the question of why is Lyndon LaRouche still a target of leading globalist forces, leading oligarchical forces, more than 2 years after his death? And why are his ideas and his movement still at the center of controversy when it comes to the battle between the collapsing empire, which is targeting him, and the potential for a new strategic and financial architecture, which is being constructed based on his ideas. I think I just answered the question for you why he's still a target. But what I want to look at is what is behind the geopolitical doctrine of dividing the world into blocks and using wars to weaken nations, weaken potential adversaries. Because this is what LaRouche's life work was based on, exposing this process and providing nations, sovereign nations, with an alternative to what today is called the unipolar hegemony of the United States, the British, and NATO. Now, when empires go into to decline, it's not a very pretty thing. They destroy their colonies. Then they turn on themselves. They devour their hosts, their own population, as it turns inward. This is the classic case of the Roman Empire, the use of divide and conquer tactics, which were studied aggressively, intensively, by supporters of the British Empire in the 19th century. And the geopolitical doctrine that emerged at the end of the 19th century was based on these studies, what you might call national identity studies, that were used by the British to figure out how to keep the world divided and maintain the power of the British Empire. But as a system like this collapses, the fissures grow, both internationally and internally. And that's why the Brits spent so much time studying how to manipulate populations under circumstances of a collapse of the central organizing force of the empire. Now, this was not only studied by the British, but what the British did was studied by Lyndon LaRouche. How the British oligarchy operated, what was their method, and how to defeat them, what is their vulnerability. And over the last 50 years, Lyndon LaRouche issued a number of forecasts, each time hitting on the head the effect of the continued looting policy of the empire, and at the same time providing solutions in the form of regional development projects, national projects, the questions of how physical economy is shaped by scientific advance. Much of this is available to you on the LaRouchePub.com website, and this is what we're going to be doing this Thursday by looking back over the lifetime of Lyndon LaRouche. But it's the fact that LaRouche's forecasts were repeatedly borne out when no one else was saying what he said. For example, forecasting the collapse of the Soviet Union within 5 years. It actually happened within 5 years and change. Forecasting the reunification of Germany, the 9/11 targeting of the United States for terrorism, and the effect that that would have with the move toward a top-down police state, the effect of the mortgage-backed security crisis, and so on. I could go through a number of those forecasts. You can find them at LaRouche Pub. But not only were his forecasts being proven to be accurate, but his solutions were increasingly circulated and being adopted by governments of nations which did not want to continue to submit to an empire in decay, which had nothing to offer them except destruction and genocide. Now, I just want to take a second to say that I think we should give some credit to people like Henry Kissinger, the Sidney Hooks of this world, John Train, the retainers of the oligarchs who targeted LaRouche. They studied LaRouche. They saw that he was an actual adversary who was standing in the way of what they were trying to do. And by giving them some credit, I'm not saying they're positive human beings, but they at least had an insight into their own degeneracy and to the potential of LaRouche's ideas to rally the population of many nations to defeat them. Now, today we see the LaRouche movement targeted by NATO, by the State Department networks, by British intelligence who are using the Ukrainian proxies to target LaRouche and to target Russia. It's worth noting that when Kissinger and others were targeting LaRouche in the early 80s, what were they saying of him? That he was a Soviet agent, that Helga Zepp-LaRouche was an East German Stasi agent. Now, what are they doing today? The Committee to Counter Disinformation of Ukraine, which is targeting the LaRouche organization along with a number of other legitimate opponents to their policies, that this is an agency which is funded and organized by the same people who ran the coup in February 2014. And this grouping centered, there are two aspects of it, the Committee to Combat Disinformation and Mirotvorets, which is actually a hit team. It was identified by Scott Ritter as the list coming out is a kill list, and Mirotvorets is a hit team, which has carried out hits. And as Dennis pointed out, there may very well be a connection between this and the attempt to kill Christine Kirchner on Friday night in Buenos Aires. So this is the network that is being used now to target the ideas of the LaRouche movement. And I'll get to that in a moment, but I want to go back to the real starting point of Lynn's importance in looking at the world today. And the place to start there is the economy, more particularly physical economy, the disintegration of an economic system that's underway now, that went into high speed after the assassination of John Kennedy, but then was pushed ahead further by the decision in August 1971 to end the Bretton Woods system, to end the reserve status of gold behind the dollar, to move into a floating exchange system and turning the world into a speculative casino economy. One of the key people involved in that was Paul Volcker, who worked very closely with a leading oligarchical family member, George P. Shultz, to convince Nixon that he had to remove or end the Bretton Woods system to save the dollar, and in the process destroyed the U.S. economy. Volcker was there in the meetings in 1971. He was there during the rest of the 70s. He told a congressional committee in 1976 that, quote, the standard of living of the average American has to decline, unquote. He said that long before anyone had heard of Klaus Schwab or the World Economic Forum. In fact, he was involved in something called the Trilateral Commission's Project 1980s, which was a project calling for the controlled disintegration of the financial system and the economy. And under the impact of this policy, and by the way, most of the Carter administration was part of the 1980s project, including the Defense Secretary Harold Brown, including Michael Blumenthal, who was the Treasury Secretary, and importantly, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the National Security Advisor. But when Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve, as inflation was spiking, as a result of the policies of the 1980s project, Volcker launched a drive, supposedly an anti-inflation drive, by raising interest rates to above 20%, the prime rate to above 20%. Now, some misguided conservatives today say that, well, it worked, it stopped inflation. And they say that correctly that one of the causes of inflation is the flood of money that had been created before that. Well, what they miss is that it's not the flood of money that caused inflation. It's where the money went. That when you put money into speculation, into buying and selling ever more risky financial instruments to increase your profits, all you're doing is increasing your indebtedness, increasing the need for a flow of liquidity to cover the bad debt. And the solution is not to stop credit It's to stop speculation. But since the speculators were the ones who funded the 1980s project, who backed Volcker, who backed Schultz, who backed Kissinger, they did it the opposite way. And the effect was to reduce the productive sector of the US economy during the period of Volcker's term at the Federal Reserve by close to 50%, to reduce the amount of steel production, to reduce the spending in infrastructure, in energy production, in major areas of science and technology. And this led directly into the Michael Milken junk bond bubble, the mergers and acquisition bubble, and so on, that became the predecessor to the mortgage-backed security bubble and the dot-com bubble under Bill Clinton. Now, this was controlled disintegration, and it's continued. It continued after 2008 with a decision once again to pump money. Instead of shutting down the bankrupt companies or reorganizing them, instead of shutting down the speculators and forcing them to eat their own debts, they got bailed out. The bubble system was bailed out. The physical economy was again halved, nearly halved by this. Now, this is the background to Jerome Powell's speech at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, just over a week ago. It was a very short speech. What he said is, we need pain. Echoing Volcker's comments that the American people will have to have a lower standard of living, he said, you're going to have to live with pain because that's the only way to get rid of the inflation. And he went on to say that if what we're doing now with these moderate increases in interest rates doesn't do that, we'll have to go to the full Volcker method. Now, that's the threat that was posed. We see it reflected in comments by other figures. The Belgian Prime Minister, for example, said last week, this will be a terrible winter in Europe. So will the next 5 to 10 winters. A decade of suffering of the people of Europe for the Green New Deal and the geopolitical confrontation with Russia and China. That's what he said. Macron, the president of France, said the era of abundance is over. Well, is there abundance in much of the world? Many sections of the world have never seen abundance, in the same way that the colonies of Rome never saw abundance, and eventually the people in Rome had no abundance, as we see growing numbers of people in France taking to the streets to protest the economic conditions they're facing. Now, LaRouche was in the forefront for the last 50 years combating this idiocy, the idiocy of the so-called free market globalization policy that led to the outsourcing and the shutdown of industry, of physical economy in the advanced sector. He was in the forefront of the fight against the green agenda, which was only beginning in the late 60s when he first became prominent and came to the attention of the FBI. But he continued that fight up to the present day. Our movement has been building networks of real scientists exposing the fraud of man-made climate change as a Malthusian con to reduce the world's population. Now, when you think about LaRouche's role in this, and as Dennis pointed out, you'll know a lot more about this after the Thursday event on the history and life of Lyndon LaRouche. You'll see why it is that the Committee to Combat Disinformation in Kiev is targeting the LaRouche movement. Actually, the Ukrainians are just doing what they're told to do, what they're told to do by the British and British agents in the US permanent bureaucracies and NATO, just as they're being told to sacrifice their army, sacrifice their country to try to degrade Russia. And by the way, when I say that, what that is identified by the Committee to Combat Disinformation is a Russian propaganda point. When you say that the people of Ukraine are the victims of their delusional government, which believes it can win a war against Russia, and that they're the victims of NATO and the United States and the United Kingdom using them as a sledgehammer against Russia. Instead of seeing that as something that the Ukrainians could rally around and go for negotiations, that's identified as a Putin talking point. And the people who say things like that, including me, are called information terrorists. Now, this organization, Mirotvorets, was set up in March 2014. The same time, a similar operation was set up called Stop Fake, one of the original fact-checking operations. And it was set up to protect the narrative of what happened in Maidan Square in February 2014, that this was not a coup, according to NATO and according to the people who funded it. This was a democratic revolution. Now, the facts are very different. As admitted by the Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland, who admitted that $5 billion was spent by the State Department to pull off that coup. George Soros contributed to that coup. The National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute, American non-governmental organizations contributed money to the coup, and at the same time, who were they backing? They were backing the Ukrainian so-called nationalists, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which later spawned the Azov Battalion, but which were very proudly self-identified as Nazis in the tradition of Stefan Bandera, who was a collaborator of Hitler in the 1940s. Now, what the Committee for Combating Disinformation and Mirotvorets put out was a list of people they say were the propagandists of the Russian line. And they published at various times thousands of names of journalists who were in Ukraine. And they were called on this. The European Union issued a protest of this. In June 2016, the G7 ambassadors issued a protest expressing their concern about the release of the personal data of journalists. 4,000. No one knows how many names are on the full list. The United Nations at one point called for an investigation. In 2018, the German Foreign Ministry. One of the reasons they called for an investigation is several people on the list were assassinated, including journalists in Ukraine. All of this was the predecessor to the July 14th, 2022 conference, which was held in Kiev to identify to try to establish the term information terrorist as a legitimate designation for someone who disagreed with the funding of the weaponization of Ukraine, someone who demanded negotiations, an end to the war, and instead of being supported by the Ukrainian people, the CCD, asserting that it was speaking for the Ukrainian people, said anyone who says these things is a Putin propagandist. Now, this meeting in July 2022 handed out a list of 72 or 78 names, the numbers have changed a little bit, of people who were designated not only as information terrorists, but as war criminals. On that list, very prominently, was Helga LaRouche as one of 30 people who spoke at Schiller Institute conferences during the most recent period, during the last year. It included very prominent people such as Ray McGovern. It included people who did not speak at the Schiller Institute conferences, but nevertheless shared the outlook in some ways, of the Schiller Institute. People like Tulsi Gabbard, Scott Ritter, other people, Colonel Richard Black, who many of you are familiar with, Diane Sayre, the candidate for for senator of New York, and I was on the list. Now, that July 14th meeting was co-sponsored by the SBU National Academy. That's the Ukrainian Secret Service. It was co-sponsored by the State Department non-governmental organization called the Civilian Research and Development Fund Global, which is largely run out of the State Department. It was funded by organized by the Ukrainian National Cyber Security Center, which has backing from agencies in the UK, the United States, and NATO. And at that meeting, what they said is that those that they're listing are, quote, bringing Russian propaganda narratives into Europe and American media during academic and public debates. That was a statement from Andrei Shapovalov, who is the acting director of the Committee to Combat Disinformation. Now, what are these propaganda narratives? I've referred to a few of them before. Well, they said, while declaring support for Ukraine and condemning Russian aggression, they tried to persuade Ukraine to enter into negotiations. So it's a Russian propaganda point to say we should have negotiations to end the war? Well, that's what they're saying. In other words, no debate, no dialogue. If you oppose sending weapons to Ukraine, you're a Putin puppet. If you speak of a proxy war, even though this is the actual definition, it should be the definition of what a proxy war is. That's an example of a Russian propaganda narrative. And if you say there are Nazis in Ukraine, you're just giving credibility to Putin's lies, in spite of the fact that there's photographic evidence that large numbers of the Azov battalion members have the Nazi Sonnenrad symbol tattooed on them, have tattoos of Stefan Bandera, and as we just heard, the would-be assassin of Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, the former president of Argentina, her would-be assassin had that same Azov battalion symbol on his arm. Now, we moved aggressively to expose this, not as a Ukrainian operation, because the whole Ukraine operation is not just about Ukraine. It's about the collapse of the empire and the decision that was made in the West to destabilize and weaken Russia so that Russia could not be part of a reorganization of the financial system. Well, that's already underway. As they say in Texas, that horse has left the barn. You already have negotiations going on throughout major international institutions such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa organization, the Organization of Islamic Countries, the African Union. They're all in discussion of how to deal with a collapse of the dollar system, the inflation, the supply problems, the lack of energy available. And in their discussions, they're concluding that the existing unipolar system does not serve their interests. And as sovereign nations, a point many of them keep making, they have a right to seek alternative solutions rather than meekly submitting to the rules of the so-called rules-based order. And that's what this fight is all about. And that's why the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche have come to the fore, because during his lifetime, with his wife Helga, they met with many heads of state, many parliamentary leaders around the world. They spoke in conferences all over the world. And what did they talk about? A new Bretton Woods, breaking out of this Anglo-American world order, which is for the benefit of the international corporate cartels in finance, insurance, big pharma, the grain cartels, and so on. And instead moving toward a world in which sovereign nation states can deliberate on what's in the interests of their people. And that should be offered to Ukraine as well. When you talk about security guarantees, that's what we've been talking about. Ukraine has a right to security guarantees, but so do the Russians. Oh no, That's a Putin talking point. Now, lest you think this is something that our initial mobilization against them put to rest, the last 2 days there was a conference in Kiev, a roundtable on September 1st and 2nd on, quote, combating disinformation in the conditions of military operations. Again, it was sponsored by the Ukraine National Security and Defense Council, the Center for Countering Disinformation. There were representatives from 24 nations there, mostly the same nations that are supporting the NATO war against Russia, mainly the European Union, NATO, the Five Eyes countries, and that's basically who was there. It included 2 senior so-called experts on disinformation from NATO, and specifically NATO's Strategic Communications Center. It included diplomats and so-called experts from the US, France, Germany, Sweden, Poland, Canada, and the Baltic nations among the 24 countries. It was presided over by the same Shapovalov who released the 72 or 78 names back in July. And what he said in his speech is, we must recognize infoterrorism as a crime. We must prosecute those who engage in the crime as information terrorists. Alexei Danilov, another one of these characters, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, said that the information front is as important in winning a war as fighting on the battlefield. And so this is the fight they've chosen to wage, the idea of hybrid warfare, that there's only one narrative that's accepted, which is the one cranked out by the unipolar order. Anything else is at best a distraction, at worst information terrorism, and the people who commit it should be treated as terrorists, including possibly the death sentence. Now, that's not an exaggeration, because we saw someone who was on the Mirotvorets list assassinated 2 weeks ago in Moscow. Daria Dudina, who was on that list as an enemy of the state. And after she was killed, most likely by someone deployed from the Ukrainian secret services and backed up by NATO, after she was killed, her picture appeared on the Mirotvorets website with a red line through it saying liquidated. There you can see it on the screen. Was there any comment against this from anyone in the West? Were any governments protesting that this happened? No, in fact, as I just pointed out to you, a week after this occurred, they gathered again in Kiev to reassert their commitment to exterminating information terrorists. Now, I want to just finish with one final point, because what we're told is that this is not about a collapsing empire. It's about a battle between democracies and autocracies. Now, let's listen to the words of someone who's a foreign minister of one of the supposedly democratic countries, Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany. She said the other day, Germany will continue to provide aid to Ukraine no matter, quote, no matter what my German voters think, unquote. That is, if the German people oppose it, it doesn't matter. The German government will continue to provide arms to Ukraine. Is that democracy? Now, one other point just worth bringing up. In Joe Biden's speech the other night, where he basically declared that everyone who voted for Trump in the last election is suspect of being a terrorist, a white racist, or semi-fascist was the term he used before. Someone should ask him, who's arming the neo-Nazis in Ukraine? It's his government, whether he knows it or not. It's his government. It's the governments of the so-called democracies that are pouring arms into the hands of would-be terrorists And finally, on this point, with all the outrage about the war, where was the outrage about the killings that were going on for 8 years in Donbass? Now, one of the reasons that Lyndon LaRouche came to the attention of the people who support this global world order is that he never hesitated to call them out. He identified not just who they are, but how they think and what their vulnerabilities are. They are very vulnerable now because most of the world is moving against them. And as we go into this hard winter, where many countries in the so-called advanced sector will have people freezing to death and starving to death because of the idiot policies of the Green New Deal and the war in Ukraine, there'll be more people who will rally to the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche. And that's why Helga Zepp-LaRouche and many of my colleagues and people who participate in Schiller Institute conferences have been put on the kill list. And that's why this institution, this so-called Committee to Combat Disinformation, must be shut down by an international mobilization, because it's intolerable to have someone say there's no allowance for debate and discussion. That is the kind of hypocrisy that not only has to be called out, but defeated.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Harley. We're getting several questions for you. And what we're going to do, if you just joined us, you're watching the webcast Manhattan meeting of the LaRouche organization. We, at the top of our hour, we reflected upon some things that had just happened in Argentina with the attempted assassination of the former president, now vice president of that country, Christina Kirchner. And let me simply note that in the case of the Christchurch shooter in New Zealand, the case of the Buffalo shooter at the supermarket, and the case of the would-be assassin here, these are all people who had, in one way or the other, either by tattoo affiliation or otherwise sometimes by intellectual affiliation, referenced Azov Battalion or referenced the neo-Nazi phenomenon. And I think it's important to recognize that this is is not something that we alone represent. In fact, I think we've got a little 30-second clip which references this. And Jose, let's show that now. But just before we show it, actually, let's just point out that we'll be having our conference next Saturday, Inspiring Humanity to Confront the Greatest Crisis in World History. We'll make sure that we have the graphic there now. That's very good. On the 100th anniversary of Lyndon LaRouche's birth, Lynn was born on September 8th of 1922. And you're welcome to register for that conference. Just go to the Schiller Institute site and you can do that. But let's just reference this discussion, which I think was on the Rising webcast.
The Department of Defense-sponsored Warrior Games features liberal comedian Jon Stewart awarding a member of Ukraine's neo-Nazi Azov Battalion at Disney World. The Gray Zone reports that multiple Ukrainian Nazis were invited to the happiest place on earth by the Pentagon. But don't worry, his black sun tattoo was covered up when he received the award. According to Wikipedia, the black sun symbol is widely used by neo-fascists, neo-Nazis, the far right, and white nationalists.
How interesting.
Yeah, how interesting is right. So, Harley, you want to make a comment about that before we...
Well, it's nice to see that there are a couple of journalists who actually believe in journalism. And on this, I would point out that besides what we're doing, one place that has been pretty much on the case on this has been the Gray Zone. And of course, they're probably on the information terrorist list also. But, the fact that you can't say that there are Nazis in Ukraine because that will wreck the story of the wonderful freedom-loving democratic nation fighting against the brutal Russians. So you see something like that, and you imagine if people actually were given that kind of information every single day, Now, the point is, people can then decide if someone wants to drive all foreigners out of Ukraine, as the Bandera movement did, if they conducted pogroms in the 1940s, if they were targeting people who they considered political opponents from 2014 to 2022, is that a good group? Is that someone we should be supporting? That should be the discussion. That should be a subject for debate without having a fear that you might have a car bomb go off when you try to start your car the next day.
We have several questions, as I said, but before we go to them, I think what we'll do, since we had a few questions about Lynn, the 100th birthday, and so on, is we have a video of Lynn from 1997, a discussion that he's doing, which might well illustrate what Harley was talking about why it was that Lyndon LaRouche was so feared. The particular topic that he appears to be discussing at that time is the problem that was going on in 1997 at that time, summer of 97, which involved particular wars, particularly in Congo, as well as a famine circumstance in portions of Africa. And so Lyndon LaRouche was referring to this, but you'll notice in what you're about to hear that it appears as though he could have been talking about yesterday. And this is perhaps the best way for us to indicate to you the mind behind the forecasts. We often talk about the things that Lyndon LaRouche did or said at different times, and then they came true much later. But the mind behind the forecasts was what was that which caused so much fear for members of the transatlantic oligarchy. So we'll show that video to you now.
What I shall do is to give you the situation in which this problem of Africa today is situated. The situation both as it bears upon our condition. This is not something in some other country with which we may or may not be concerned as our moral inclinations guide us. This is something which affects us directly. If Africa dies, most of us will die. I'll indicate that to you somewhat. But also there's a second question, is what do we do about it? How do we change it? Not simply how do we condemn it, but how do we change it? How to reverse it? Perhaps how do we go forward in order to provide for the people of Africa who are now being victimized what they have long deserved and have not yet received? The opportunity to develop their own nations and to participate in those things which the rest of us, at least used to, consider our right. Now, look around you and get a glimpse of reality. This is not a story on a television screen. This is not a story in a book or a play on a stage. This is reality. This is not about Africans. This is about you. You're in the same play. You're in the same world. And the things that are hurting the Africans are already hurting most of you, whether you're in the United States or some other country. What threatens Africans is threatening you, whether you're in Africa, the United States, or any other part of this planet. It affects people in Iran. It affects people in China who may not, in the hinterlands of China, where the development now in progress is not yet fully reached. It affects their destiny. It affects the people in North Korea who are subjected to a famine, being fostered by the friends of George Bush in the Koreas and in that part of the world generally. We are all affected. We're in the same drama. The same evil that is killing Africans is killing us, or will kill us soon. The same evil is responsible for blown out credit cards in the United States, for the increase of the death rate, for the person that has turned away from the hospital that no longer exists to die, for the person who was left on the streets to die because they didn't have the right cards to be admitted for treatment. For the people who were suffering from diseases because of the deterioration of the environment, or suffering from diseases, epidemic diseases, which we once brought under control. The people who are hungry, the people who are afraid of certain parts of the city where people are killing in a kind of new age orgy of drugs and death. Little children, teenage children are considered the most dangerous criminals in this country. It's part of the same problem. We are in a decaying civilization and have been in a decaying civilization for the past 30-odd years. Gradually, as our society has been decaying, as our morals have been decaying, as our commitment and institutions have been decaying, as the economy which affects us all has been decaying, things become worse and worse and worse. Now, for the ordinary human being who doesn't always think too carefully, who thinks too selfishly, who thinks too narrowly, who thinks too much in terms of locality and in terms of the passing moment of central experience in personal life, 30 years is a long time. In the course of history, 30 years is not a long time. It's like a moment. And the evil that we did to ourselves 30 years ago, or that we tolerated to be done to ourselves, has caught up with us 30 years later. It has been 30 years downhill. If you could take, you remember you've probably seen sometime these so-called lapse time photography. You take a camera and you take it out in a garden or you take it in a hothouse and you aim it at a plant and you click a frame every few minutes or so forth. Now you take that film, which is clicked a frame every few minutes, and you speed it up to, say, 16 or 32 or whatever frames per second. And now you see the weed that was growing, moving and writhing. You see the flower exploding. Yeah? And you say, oh, if you just get the right time scale, how different plant life looks. Or you can do the same thing with a bacteriological culture done under a microscopic procedure, the same thing. Now look at this past 30 years with the eye of lapse time photography. Look at the changes in our society, all over the world, in terms of lapse time photography. Think of how things were different and mostly better in the United States 30 years ago. Think of neighborhoods, say in Washington, D.C., which 30 years ago may have been somewhat poor, but were habitable, which were secure, where families lived and raised children. Think of Howard University. Think of the hospitals that were here that are no longer here. Think of the killing in the streets which was not there 30 years ago. Now think over 30 years. Think of the process of change, of deterioration of life around us. And 30 years is not such a long time. It's a moment. So don't think, well, what we did 30 years ago, that's not important. Let's talk about more recent events. But more recent events were shaped by decisions we made 30 years ago. The child is the parent to the adult. From the child comes the adult. From the decision comes a process of growth, a process of change. And to understand how the change came about, you've got to go back to when the change started. So therefore, when you say something is happening in Africa, genocide in Africa, we are not simply talking about something on the African stage. We're not simply saying have empathy for the suffering people of some foreign country as if they were some foreign planet. What we're seeing is the symptom in Africa of the moral self-destruction of the entire civilization. So therefore, you cannot cure the problems of Africa by simply addressing the problems of Africa, though they must be addressed. Because to address something means that you intend to succeed, not simply make a token protest. How do we succeed in reversing what is going on in Africa? Not how do we protest. How do we stop it and reverse it? Well, Some people say God is powerful and wise. A civilization in past, again, another thing from history, civilizations and cultures which continue to do what we are doing to ourselves as our civilization and culture. These civilizations have been overthrown like the great empires in the dust of Mesopotamia, which fell one after the other, like Sodom and Gomorrah, which are gone. We have a few relics of that, but it's gone. In the philosophy departments of our universities, I believe. Nations and empires which were evil are gone. They were destroyed. And this civilization, if it doesn't fix itself, will also be destroyed. We are in the process of destroying ourselves. And what does that mean? We used to be a nation which is committed to scientific and technological progress. We used to be a nation that was committed to universal education, and we fought to improve the quality of education and to extend that improved quality to everyone. No longer. In the middle of the 1960s, under the influence of a cultural shock, we went from a nation committed to scientific and technological progress to a post-industrial utopia. We threw our morals in the ash can in order to jump into a bordello called the rock, drug, sex counterculture. Well, our entertainment is no longer moral. It isn't even fit to watch. And people take a lot of it. We drug our minds. More people are doing it. We kill each other. More people are doing it. Government has become totally immoral. The justice system is no longer a justice system. It's like a hunt. It's like a game hunt, wild game hunt. And the guy who comes back with the biggest trophies, the most money, the most scalps in the prosecution system prevails. The question is, what do you do? And the image that comes to mind in the United States is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who took us out of a Great Depression, out of a Wilson Coolidge Depression, and under the guise of a war economy, made this nation, again, the most powerful nation on the planet. And all of us who went through that experience, and those who heard about the experience, said there was a time in the midst of a great crisis when a great president once again reached out to uplift and mobilize the nation to rebuild the nation and to revive it. We need a president to do that, they tend to say. And you've got Bill Clinton. Well, you say, well, Bill Clinton's president. This is going to come on his watch. You're going to have to make Bill Clinton the president who can do what has to be done. It's what you do if you're a citizen. If the president doesn't lack some abilities, you find ways of giving him the abilities he needs and the encouragement, which may take various forms, including harsh ones, to get him to do the job. So what's happening is it's not a hopeless situation. It's a division of the waters. It's a fork in the road. You cannot go backwards. The bridge you just came across is collapsing. There's no way back. You have to go forward. And like Hamlet in Shakespeare's play, you have to decide, as he's discussed and failed in his great soliloquy, to be or not to be. There's one road, which is the old way of doing things, which leads to certain doom for himself and his nation. There's another way, another road, with which he's unfamiliar, which leads away from doom, but he's not familiar with the road. And because of his cowardice, his intellectual cowardice, he refuses to take the new road, and that said takes the road which he knows will lead, and does in the play, to his self-destruction and the destruction of his nation. We have come to that kind of point. Yes, there is a future. The past is dead. That road you cannot walk anymore. Those institutions, those banks, they don't exist anymore, not in that form. But how does the human race go on? What happens to the passengers on the sinking Titanic? First, they must get off the Titanic. But where do they go? What direction do they take? So then the great question now is not what is the past is dead, except for those who refuse to face reality. The old system is dead. The question is, which road to the future?
So Harley, first, if you have any response to that, and I'll also just indicate to you, you've got, several questions here. I'm going to bunch some of them because I know you have some limitations on time. But first, if you'd like to respond to what you heard.
Well, I'll simply say that when he talked about a 30-year period of decline, we're now at the 50-year mark of that. And if you take his metaphor of the lapsed time photography, you look at what's happening in around the world. You look at countries that have been destroyed by these regime change wars. You look at Afghanistan. You look at Yemen. You look at the situation that people in Africa are facing. And then you look at American cities. Once again, that was a very prophetic series of statements that he was making. And at the same time, he was putting forward solutions. And that's the legacy of Lyndon LaRouche, is that you have to know what brought you here, but you don't have to stay on that same vehicle. Get off it and go a different direction. And as he said in the end, that's where we are now. We have an opportunity because much of the world is turning against this new world order, this new globalization, free market, neoliberal policy. Most of the world is done with it. But the leadership has to be there with the alternative. And that's why people should register for our conference next weekend, because that's what we'll be discussing.
Yeah, that's right. The conference is called Inspiring Humanity to Act Against the Greatest Crisis in World History. What we're going to do here is, given the topic that we've been discussing all afternoon concerning Ukraine and the Center for Countering Disinformation, the broader implications of that, which I think Lyndon LaRouche just made clear, that you're never talking about Africa or Ukraine or Argentina. You're always talking and must be talking about a broader process. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read you two questions, and we have a video clip, which is of relevance, where there are other questions asked, and then ask you to respond. They're all around Ukraine. So first, there's Johnny from Canada. He says, I'm in Canada, so it's impossible even to explain Ukraine issues. On top of that, we have the largest Ukraine Banderites outside of Ukraine, concentration of Ukrainian Banderites. We have statues for Bandera here in Canada and had them long before they appeared in Ukraine. People just don't get it and call you conspiracy names and whatnot. Most don't read. And he said, I like this channel. I referred to several students around here to check this out. In their Kherson offensive, Ukraine seems to be throwing all they have. Once that concludes, maybe they will run out of steam. What do you suggest in dealing with this issue? I will just reference that the video we're going to play in part, which is from the Duran, talks about that Kherson issue. Second question is from Yoshi, and he says, I contacted my reps on the Ukraine hit list. They liked my concern, saluted my military service, and said they will pass my concerns on to the actual representatives. They then began asking me my concerns toward, quote, their agenda and asking for financial contributions. How can we get these guys to take this seriously? So those are the two questions directly on Ukraine. Now what we should do is just do the video so some people are aware of what at least some journalists, as Harley indicated before, are attempting to do in the face of a total media blackout otherwise.
All right, Alexander, let's do an update as to what's going on in Ukraine. We have the Kherson counteroffensive. We have the Zaporozhye amphibious assault, and both were failures, but the Kherson counteroffensive looks like it's going to continue, and they're going to go on their third and fourth and fifth wave. of advances or try to advance, but it seems like the Russians have everything under control. This is a massive failure. The media is not reporting on it, to be quite honest, in the West. Even Ukraine has kind of put a gag order not to allow journalists to talk about this either. And this is a major defeat and embarrassment for the collective West, for Boris Johnson, who probably ordered this, if you believe the rumors. For Zelensky, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant assault is a massive embarrassment, not reported by any mainstream media outlets. This is going to boomerang back and really, really damage the Zelensky regime. I dare say this might be the end of the Zelensky regime. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but I'm saying this has definitely opened the door to it, because the deaths and the casualties and the suffering from this reckless initiative are stunning. Lines at blood banks, hospitals full. I mean, just this was a disaster.
Absolutely. Disaster is not even it was an apocalyptic disaster. I mean, it was a disaster on the scale of some of those battles that we've all heard about, at least in Britain, from the First World War. You know, the Battle of the Somme, the battles of Passchendaele, you know, First and Second and Third Ypres and all these things. I mean, it's just horrendous. And you're absolutely right. There's an almost complete media blackout on them.
Okay, so Harley?
Well, first on Canada, the person who asked the question should be somewhat encouraged by the response that we've been getting from Canada. Large numbers of people are writing in on our Facebook page for my daily updates, saying, why can't we do something in Canada? Well, we can. I mean, Canada is a problem because it's part of the British Empire. But many, many people there recognize the corruption in Canada as a result of being part of the empire. The Five Eyes intelligence controls the country, the media, and the prime minister there. But on the Bandera question, it's really important to note that the deputy prime minister, the former foreign minister, Chrystia Freeland, is the granddaughter of someone who ran a Nazi paper in the early 1940s after the Germans captured Ukraine and took over a newspaper that was devoted to promoting the Nazi takeover of Ukraine and calling for pogroms. The editor who wrote those editorials calling for pogroms was the grandfather of Chrystia Freeland, the present deputy prime minister of Canada. So it's not surprising that you have that problem there, but we've got to expose it. That's the only thing I can say about that. Now, on what you showed from the Durand, let me do something that I've just been reading through the last couple of days, the beginnings of the cyber warfare operation that we're now seeing, whether it's the Ukrainian Committee to Combat Disinformation or the RAND Corporation, whose story wins, the idea of hybrid warfare. And I found something interesting in a book called A Man Called Intrepid. It's a somewhat accurate story of Sir William Stevenson, who was in charge of the British security coordination during World War II. He was sent by the British to coordinate activity in the United States before the U.S. was in the war. And his directives to the members of the British security coordination team, and this was run out of Rockefeller Center in New York, was we need to spy on enemies, we need to protect British property and interests, and 3, convince the American public of the need to aid Britain. And in the process of doing that, he invented a modern version of fake news. And I was reflecting back on Orwell's 1984, whether this was part of what went into Orwell's writing there. Stevenson set up something, let's see. It was called the British and Overseas Features. It was a press agency that ran about 20 stories a day. And the purpose of this agency was to convince people that the British were heroically resisting the Nazis. Now, an example in this book is on June 18th, 1941. He, as a coordinator of British intelligence, put out a story that said there was a successful raid on a Nazi outpost at something called Berck-sur-Mer in France. Now, this was right after Dunkirk, where the British had an ignominious retreat from continental Europe, a big defeat. So he had this story posted in the media about how the Nazis were caught by surprise, they suffered a big defeat. The only problem is it never happened. It was invented by MI6 under the direction of Stevenson to improve morale in Great Britain. And what he engaged in from his BSC operation was manipulated polls to convince Americans that everyone wanted to support the British. They put out fake stories. He later said that such operations were needed to counter, quote, a treasury of misinformation, unquote. In other words, use disinformation to counter what you consider unwelcome news. I mean, that's the best I could put it, because the idea, in his case, it was clear that he was creating fake stories to cover the fact that everything they were trying wasn't working. Now, I bring this up because he's the person who largely was involved in organizing the CIA. He had an in with Bill Donovan. He was involved in the OSS, and he was part of the British input after the war into the U.S. intelligence community. He's also a heroic figure in the GCHQ, which is the cybersecurity operation of the British government. So, you know, this is nothing new. Fake news is not new. It was there at a point in history when the British Empire needed the United States. They didn't think you could tell the Americans the truth and get the United States to do something, even though he knew that Roosevelt was inclined to eventually get into the war and fight the Nazis. But they had to make stuff up as a way of trying to get their way. So, you know, when it comes to the long-awaited Ukrainian offensive, what we're reading in the Western press is very limited, because there's nothing to report except what the Duran was saying, which was a defeat for the Ukrainian military.
Okay, Harley, what we've got otherwise is two further questions for you, and then if you need to make summary remarks, you could just go ahead, given if your time situation. One is from Chuck, who just asked, how has the cutoff of gas to Nord Stream begun to impact Germany? And then the second is from Atamwali, who asks what you think of Poland having recently demanded reparations from Germany, where that may lead. Those are the two questions.
Well, the second one's requires a longer answer, but the first one, look, what's happening in Germany is there's great nervousness. And that's why someone like Baerbock is saying, it doesn't matter what the people want, we're going to continue doing what we're doing. And there's a lot of discussion of problems within the coalition. There's the Bundesverfassungsschutz, which is the German equivalent of the FBI, essentially endorsed the Committee for Countering Disinformation by saying that anyone who says that the inflation was not caused by Putin is pushing Russian talking points. The same story is out that you've got the energy crisis is caused by Putin. If you don't believe that, you're a Russian agent. Well, the fact of the matter is that the green policy, combined with the sanctions, is what's causing the spike in prices, combined with the speculation. Because until recently, the oil hadn't stopped flowing. the shortages that were forecast were not here, but the price went up anyway, because the prices started going up in oil and gas before the war. So, what we're seeing with this is a great deal of panic. There's discussions of blackouts and brownouts. They're preparing major warming centers for families that lose their power. There are going to be increased taxes to cover the costs of increased fuel and electricity. There's still a debate over whether the final nuclear plant will be shut down. I mean, it's worth noting, and this is a good thing, that in California they decided to keep the Diablo Canyon plant open. But that's a stopgap measure. So what we're seeing in Germany is utility prices going through the roof. It's not as bad as the United Kingdom. And ironically, the United Kingdom is getting hit really hard because Boris Johnson was such a fool. I'm pursuing the sanctions policy. So, as I said earlier, they're talking about this will be a horrible winter, but it may continue for a number of years. There's no alternative system in place. If you do what the German government is talking about, getting rid of combustion engines and moving everything to electric cars, where the hell are you going to get the electricity? So this is a disaster which is just beginning to unfold. Now, the second question was on the Polish demand for reparations. Poland's a hard place to figure out because there are all kinds of rumors of what's actually going on in Poland. They want more U.S. NATO troops. There are rumors that the Poles are waiting for the Ukrainian government to collapse to go in and seize land in Ukraine. But this one, given that Poland is depending on Germany as part of NATO, it makes no sense that they would come up with this demand for additional reparations, but it also raises an interesting question. If they want money from Germany because of the atrocities the Nazis committed in Poland in World War II, why will they not oppose Nazi atrocities in Ukraine today? So, I'm not sure what's going on with this in Poland, but I think it caught people in Germany by surprise, and it's part of the process of fissuring of unity in NATO, which may very well end in the very near future as the effect of the sanctions policy and the energy problems and the inflation hit the population harder, especially if you have tone-deaf leaders like Baerbock who say, we don't care what the population wants, we know what we're going to do.
Okay, well, Harley, we want to thank you for being with us today. I don't know if you have any chance to say anything at the end. Of course, you're one of the people, as was already said, on the kill list. There's, we don't actually know how many people are actually on it. I mean, at one point, there's something like 200,000 people these people have at some point or the other identified. And of course, our idea is that if those people are unified and begin to get the attention of the nations of the world, that this whole process can be destroyed. Are you optimistic that that can happen?
Well, I have to be optimistic. I mean, the basic point is that there is truth. They're not narratives. Narratives are falling apart. They can be debunked. The question is, do people have the guts to face the truth and to reach a truthful conclusion based on their own critical thinking? And our job is to inspire people to expand their capacity for critical thinking, as opposed to swallowing narratives. And given what I've seen in the last 18 months or so with the changes in the world, and by the way, that's what's fueling the desperation of NATO and the people running the Biden administration and the United Kingdom, the City of London and Wall Street. It's their desperation and their fear that there's going to be a continuing, expanding Great Awakening against them that convinces me that we can win this fight. And it's also that the evil is so blatant. When you say you can't even discuss a differing idea, and that's democracy. Well, that's not democracy. And I think people have had it with this establishment. The only question is, will they allow themselves to act on their not just their anger, but on their ability to be creative, loving human beings committed to fighting for a better world. And I think most people in the world want that. They just are deluged by a blizzard of lies, and they have a hard time picking through it. But that's our job, to help them pick through it.
All right. Thank you again for being with us. And for everybody that's watching, you can see Harley again on Wednesday when the press conference occurs. And then next Saturday, I think he's going to be moderating one of the panels at the conference, the Schiller Institute conference, inspiring humanity to survive the greatest crisis in world history. So thank you very much, Harley.
And they can see me every day on the daily update on the LaRouche organization.
That too. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Daily update.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks, Dennis. See you soon.
Sure. Now, one of the questions that we had gotten, which came from Yoshi, had asked, how can we take these guys, meaning the senators and congressmen, to take this seriously? And so we have an offering, which we are going to show as to some of our people who in action, in discussion with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York.
All right. Hi, Ms. Gillibrand. My name's Jose Vega. I'm a proud Bronx resident, born and raised here. Listen, I do have one issue with you. I hope that's okay.
Yes, please.
You know, you said that it requires citizens to stand up and speak about what's right. I want to talk about Ukraine because what's happening is that you approved funds to go over there, and then there's this list that's floating around that was put out by the Center for Countering Disinformation of Ukraine. And the problem is that you have American candidates, American citizens there who are critical of America's foreign policy, who are on this list. And you have received a letter, you and other members on the on this committee of intelligence have received a letter from Scott Ritter that says that these lists are hit lists. Historically, these are hit lists. And you and Senator Schumer and other senators voted to send funding over to Ukraine, and this funding is being used to put American candidates, American citizens on this hit list. There are people right now who are critical of foreign policy who are at risk of dying because they disagree with this war, they disagree with the funding of this Ukrainian-Russian war, and they disagree with the provocations of the United States funding Ukrainian Nazis since 2014. So I'm here to ask you, because one of the people on the list is Diane Sayre. She's a LaRouche independent candidate who got her name on the ballot, and she's on this list.
What's the list? I don't know about this.
Well, you should know about this, ma'am.
Tell me about this list. Who wrote the list?
This was written by the Center for Countering Disinformation, and on that same day, Andrei Shapovalov, called everybody on this list an information terrorist, okay? It's right here. It was organized by the U.S. Civil Research and Development Fund. Okay,
What
the
is
CRD.
that? What is the U.S.
Ukraine.
Tell me a little bit about the U.S. Civil Research Fund.
Ma'am, you voted to fund this.
Not that list.
No.
Yeah. No, what I voted. I'll say what I voted for, and then you tell me how it's related, because I don't know about this issue. So, I voted for resources for 3 things in Ukraine. 1, humanitarian assistance, like food, water. 2, the ability to be able to get people out of Ukraine and to safer countries. And 3, military equipment and the training of Ukrainian fighters by the U.S. military. That's the 3 things we funded. I don't know anything about your list. I'll look at the list. Yeah. Yeah. I'm on it.
She said she doesn't know about this list. So
I'm on it though, but I'm very concerned. I will take if you can give me that document, I will take it to the Intelligence Committee. I'll ask them what it is. And I don't think the Ukrainian Nazi thing, I think that was actually something that Putin put out there to create a reason to invade Ukraine. I don't think that's real. I think that's false information. But I will look at it.
okay. All right.
Okay.
All right, do we have another question?
All right, so now that is an expression of the deployment of what we call our Gideon's Army. For those who are not up on your Bible studies, Gideon was one of the judges of the Bible, meaning he was a warrior on behalf of Israel, who first came into prominence for his destruction of the idols or the icons. This is where we get the word iconoclastic from. And his destruction of pagan idols then led to some disagreements and fighting with the Midianites, as they were called. But he assembled an army, which was at one point over 10,000, and over the course of various discussions with the God, was caused to realize that he only needed 300 people, not the 10,000. The point was that it was 300 people who were armed with a mission and a sense of themselves. And the mission really is the same as we, in one sense, are seeing in a vaguer way, in a more general way, and perhaps in a less permanent way, being considered by people in Argentina today. I'm not about to tell you, nor would it be correct to state, that one incident like the one that happened in Argentina yesterday can transform all of history. But what's relevant, as was said by the president President Fernandez said yesterday, this was the most horrific or terrifying incident since 1983, when that country had become democratic. And it caused a kind of sudden concision in history, a kind of condensation into one historical moment in which it was clear that what could have occurred is that the vice president of that nation could have been assassinated. And obviously there are many questions to be asked about that and so on, but there's something else. What also occurred was that suddenly everyone in the nation was caused to consider his or her role in the impending future of the nation, in seeing that gun in the face of the vice president and wondering to themselves, what is my life really worth? What's the purpose of my life? That is the character of the deployment that we have to make in the form of what we're going to call our Gideon's Army deployment for the purpose of getting a new world strategic architecture, strategic and development architecture. This means a return to a kind of technological optimism, which is also, by the way, characteristic of Christina Kirchner and her husband, who was also president. Her husband served for president of Argentina from 2003 to 2007, and then she served for 8 years after his death, from 2007 and 2015. One of the things they became noted for was their return to the building of nuclear power plants. And there was a third nuclear power plant opened up in 2015, at which point she described with great pride the pride of Argentines in doing that. This is what we're looking to see happen now today, not in the United States, not in Germany, not in Italy, not in France, but everywhere, but in combination and in cooperation with Russia, with China, with India, and with all those people that we are being told are adversaries. And that we don't allow various forms of subterfuge to confuse people, like, for example, has been done with the issue of climate change. While there are, in fact, real scientific questions that might be disputed, what there can be no dispute about is what has happened to the economy of Europe under the guise of climate change, carried out as essentially a NATO policy, a military policy. Further, the notion that climate change could be addressed in any way, in the way that people have been discussing for the past several years, is patently absurd. And in everybody's formulations of this, in terms of the issue of how much the high climate of the Earth could be reduced by the measures that are being proposed, it's an absurdity. If you had to do that, which I would argue is itself not only an issue, but in fact the answer is you don't have to do it. If you really want to do it, what you do is grow a lot of trees. Trees will cool the planet, and there are ways to do that. You green the Earth, which, by the way, is not necessarily the view of certain people that hide behind the mask of environmentalism, like, for example, Prince Charles, who does not believe in greening the earth. And so the issues here are that in the world marketplace of ideas, what has to happen is a Gideon's army of citizen philosophers, lovers of wisdom, has to deploy into this moment with the greatest energy to mobilize the better angels of human nature. This cannot be done through violence. It will not work. You have too many lethal weapons, and you have too many people with too many psychological problems, let alone the governments and the leadership in governments, which also has psychological problems. If you talk about, or if you think about the idea of trying to use force to resolve these problems, you may as well not even start. You're just on a runaway train to thermonuclear extinction if you do that. So the Gideon's army that we're talking about is one that employs for it the people that wrote the military manuals for this army are people like the poet Dante Alighieri or Shakespeare or Friedrich Schiller or the Indian poet Tagore. You know, that those are the people who are the inspirers of the way in which this army is going to deploy. And I just would like to say, as we close and begin to, again, just reemphasize the pattern of the next week, the process of the next week, I'd like that people would think about taking up this conception of this Gideon's army of philosophers, of citizen philosophers, who are doing what? They're proposing alternatives, like a new strategic and development architecture for all nations, like a World Health Care platform. There's a document in particular, which was written by Helga LaRouche, called Gandhi's, as in Mahatma Gandhi's, Vision for a New Paradigm in International Relations, a World Health System, and Direct Nonviolent Action in Times of Social Breakdown. The idea of that title and the idea of the concept behind it is you have global needs which are undeniable, like clean water, like global cooperation to fight pandemics. You have specific national requirements and interests, which may sometimes conflict with the interests of other nations. And you have a need to resolve, by means of working on the problems that concern all of humanity, those differences, but non-violently. And this is the sort of the character, the impulse tendency that the Schiller Institute in particular, which we're holding that conference next week in honor of the 100th birthday of Lyndon LaRouche, who was a co-founder of the Schiller Institute and the founder of the magazine Executive Intelligence Review, and of course is the person from whom the name the LaRouche Organization comes. He was the conceptual architect of those institutions, but more importantly, of the dialogue process that we are trying to address that must now become available to as many citizens as possible. As you see the tragedies that begin to unfold, as you see the destruction that has begun to unfold, and as you see the kind of self-destruction of civilizations that goes on in these countries such as France or Italy or UK or the United States, the thing that we are requesting that people decide is that they will no longer find fault in the stars, including the stars of politics or the stars of some other area, but in themselves. Because the idea that we are underlings is merely a posture we have decided. It's a set of clothes that we have to shuffle off. We are citizens of an independent and sovereign republic, and we are able to act as such. But this is what now must be demanded in a time of social breakdown. And so, as we've said, there are a series of activities that we're requesting you all be involved with us in. If you stay in touch with our organizers and you watch this platform, you'll be informed of these activities. And we intend that through these activities, the better angels of the nature of even our adversaries are activated, are actual, and that a new world is actualized. This can be done. It may be difficult to do, but it is the only thing worth doing on behalf of humanity as a whole. And so, in the same way that in the case of Christina Kirchner last night, she looked in the eyes of death and death looked away, in that same way, we can all achieve a victory on the battlefield of immortality by doing that which is in the interest of humanity as a whole, and therefore finding our own interest in the process. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, I want to thank all of you for listening, and we'll see you next week, though we are asking that you participate in that conference next week. Again, it's called Inspiring Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. It will begin at 10 a.m., 2 panels each of Saturday and Sunday, with the second panel beginning at 2 p.m., and we hope to see you there bright and early next Saturday morning.